want to talk about Bloombarrow. It's been out for a short while now. 8 months is a while, right? Well, despite that, it's left an impact already on Magic as a whole. It's been a real gem of a set in between the race cars, cowboys, and detectives we've had lately, and it showed both financially and in popularity. We've even had Mark Rosewater rate it as one of these sets most likely to return in the future. But it's not just been a cultural impact on Magic. There's a darker side to this set, actually. And today I wanted to focus on how 3 mice from Bloombarrow have redefined aggro in Magic the Gathering. So much so, where these newer cards have not only turned standard into a format where you can consistently lose as early as turn 3, but are also a new top tier deck in Pioneer, a format with over a decade of cards in it. So what makes these aggro decks so special? Mono red aggro has existed for as old as Magic has existed, known for closing out games before your opponents can get their deck going. And to do this, red players have always looked for one word: haste. The ability to slam a creature down and swing immediately has always been a cornerstone of aggro in Magic. When I think of red aggro, I think of Monastery Swiftspear, which from the jump lets players attack and needs to be answered immediately. I also think of 2-mana 2/2s like Robber of the Rich and Bloodthirsty Adversary, which although have useful secondary abilities, saw play simply because they had the word haste stapled to them and could attack immediately. Haste has been in fact so important on red aggro in the past. Some cards, even with downsides like Phoenix Chick and Reinforced Ronin, have simply seen play because they offer that keyword. The point I'm making here is that unlike other decks, which generally relied on synergy to generate value and win games, red aggro has always thrown that out the window by simply saying, I am speed. You could argue there's an inherent synergy in building a deck focused on going as fast as possible, but to do it generally has meant putting together a bunch of low-cost creatures that don't really have any intrinsic synergy with each other until now. Enter the Bloombarrow mice. In this set, each of the 10 main creature types sort of had a core identity associated with it, encouraging you to really build a deck focused around making the most of that identity. For example, otters were all about spell slinging. Rabbits were all about swarming. For the case of mice, they were all about a new keyword called valiant, which basically gave you a benefit every single time you targeted a mouse with an ability or a spell. Many of these mice had valiant abilities that made them bigger when they got targeted. Or, alternatively, some of them even managed to generate you some value, such as tapping a creature, or in one case, even putting a creature onto the battlefield. In the end, 2 mice stood out from the crowd: Heartfire Hero, a red 1-drop, and Emberheart Challenger, a red 2-drop. Now you'll notice straight away that Emberheart Challenger is blessed with the sacred 2-mana 2/2 haste. The prowess also meant that it got bigger whenever you did cast a spell alongside it on the turn. When Bloombarrow came out and players hadn't really worked out how powerful the mice were yet, Emberheart Challenger was the first card of the bunch to really see extensive play. Simply as a 2/2, I play this creature with haste and swing for damage. And I sometimes get to play an extra card when I buff it. But it wasn't long after this that players really started recognizing how powerful this valiant ability was. Emberheart Challenger not only gave players an aggressive haste creature, but rewarded aggro players with an extra card each turn. Across many card games, one of the universal weaknesses of aggro has always been the ability to be able to outlast it. In trying to run you down with cheap-costed creatures, they'd be playing all their cards quickly and would subsequently lose all their cards quickly. Even triggering Emberheart Challenger once was giving aggro players a way to put in an additional creature, or burn spell, giving aggro much more staying power. Remember, every extra creature is another threat you have to remove, another resource you need to spend to stabilize. Okay, I hear you say, but there's always removal, right? Black still had some of the best removal spells in the format, in Cut Down, Go for the Throat, and even Shoot the Sheriff. Well, this is where our second mouse started emerging. One thing you'll notice pretty quick in Standard nowadays is how common exiling cards instead of destroying them has become. Go for the Throat is still one of the best removal spells for flexibility, but more players are now playing cards like Nowhere to Run and Anoint with Affliction, 2 cards with arguably less good targets. You have Heartfire Hero to blame for that. You see, when players figured out the power of Valiant, a few changes happened to red aggro. Red-green deck using Innkeeper's Talent, a really easy way to trigger Valiant, started appearing in numbers, and the Heartfire Hero was the go-to 1-drop for being able to buff itself very fast. The real menace it posed came from its secondary ability, being able to deal damage once it died equal to its power. Suddenly, removing red's creatures wasn't as straightforward as before. still damaging you in the process. Now, the only way to efficiently remove the Heartfire Hero was to exile it or reduce its power to 0, as since it died, even taking a little bit of damage from it was often enough to cost you later. To make matters worse, one of the spells being used to buff these mice was Snakeskin Veil, which not only started popping up to trigger Valiant, but also protected the creature at the same time, meaning you couldn't safely remove your opponent if they had an open green mana. Keep in mind, Nowhere to Run hadn't been printed yet. And it was here that the tournament results really started pouring in, and the deck was taking home trophies. It had now become clear that we were dealing with a standard aggro deck in a league of its own. To answer openly why Red Mice is such a uniquely powerful deck, it's that it's given red-based aggro its first highly synergistic deck. Remember how I praise haste for being the most important keyword in these kind of decks? Heartfire Hero doesn't have it, but a special land that can target it does. It also triggers Valiant on it, making it a 3/2 with haste the turn it comes in. That's also 3 damage you'll take if you don't exile it or block it with a bigger creature. It ended up being that Valiant is actually a very easy keyword to trigger, and players soon realized they didn't need to sacrifice non-creature spells to do it. As Duskmourn was approaching, we saw red decks cut Innkeeper's Talent for Manifold Mouse, our 3rd card and the premier way to trigger Valiant. With the 4 copies of Manifold Mouse, Heartfire Hero, and Emberheart Challenger, aggro could simply rely on their intrinsic synergy they had with each other, with Manifold Mouse being able to give them trample and double strike. You'll notice I said "and" because it is often played for its offspring cost, giving you 2 activations of the ability and up to 2 potential Valiant triggers. Take a look at mouse lists today, and outside of Monstrous Rage and protection spells, they don't really need to waste mana anymore, and precious deck slots to target their creatures. The freedom to rely on just these cards for fast power has since created a diverse meta of aggro decks. We not only have red-green mice, but also red-white mice, utilizing Sheltered by Ghosts and Lightning Helix to beat out other mice decks with life gain. And we also have mono-red mice, which spits on the life gain plan with Screaming Nemesis and Sunspire links. Look at all these decks, and you'll see 12 slots dedicated to these 3 mice and Monstrous Rage every single time. That's over a quarter of the deck and over a third of the deck if you exclude lands. In Pioneer, the format including cards from the last 10 years, just recently, a mono red deck took home a tourney, and the main deck was exactly the same as it is in Standard right now, minus a few utility lands and 2 playsets of Bone Crusher Giant and Kumano faces Kuzan. So what's next? Well, Tarkir is just dropped, and if Foundations and Aether Drift are anything to go off, red aggro will still be the fastest deck in the format. It isn't an understatement to say that if your deck doesn't have a removal spell or interaction on turn 1 and 2, you will lose the next turn versus these decks. The especially sad thing is Tarkir Dragonstorm has been a seriously well-received set, full of awesome new dragons and 3-color cards, which at this rate won't really see much play in Standard. The lands for 3-color decks are just honestly too slow right now, and if you build your deck to survive, you can bet an Up the Beanstalk player will be ready to outvalue you. The long and short is that any new deck right now needs to be able to survive the fastest deck we've seen in Standard without falling behind Domain. And outside of Pixie Bounce, which just repeatedly spams discard and removal, nothing in the last 2 sets has really managed that. The reality is, Standard, despite its flourishing and being diverse, is very pushed right now. For a new aggro deck to exist, it needs to be even faster than mice, which aren't rotating until 2027, by the way. Or we need to go the other way and print so much spot removal, creatures can't really exist. Both sound awful for the game, which is why I'll be shocked if we don't see some bans in June. A few people were hoping for bans last month, and while I believe Beanstalk may have been worthy for a ban, you can see my video about that if you want more, I'm not sure Monstrous Rage, the other card being mentioned a lot, is the right ban. The argument going around at the moment is that Monstrous Rage makes blocking impossible, since your bigger creature still dies, theirs doesn't, and you still get trample damage. While I agree with this, unless you also plan to ban Dreadmawer's Ire, card that's seen next to no play in Ixalan, which will just replace Monstrous Rage, since it also gives trample, I don't think this will fix the problem. The offender has got to be Manifold Mouse, which in my opinion, and as as recent history has shown, was the real tipping point for the dominance of our mice overlords. Without double strike, the deck slows down enough to give players at least another turn to be able to survive. And it also takes away one of Red's 4 mana plays. Honestly, even with the ban, the deck is probably still too fast for Standard, but at least it wouldn't be alone in that regard, and we might actually get to see some 3-color midrange. Soon I plan to do a video covering the big 3 of Standard, especially if Tarkir doesn't change the meta, much like the previous sets haven't. Until then, subscribe if you like what I do and want to see more, and check out my video on Beanstalk and its meta warping power across Magic. Until then, see you in the next one. Cheers!